They weren't soldiers. They were still learning how to shave, still writing letters home in uneven handwriting, still believing adults wouldn't lie to them. But in the final months of World War II, Germany ran out of men, and the state made a decision it could never undo. An order went out. It asked for no volunteers. It cared nothing for age, and nothing for survival. Boys were pulled from classrooms and cellars, given oversized uniforms, borrowed rifles, and words meant to sound like purpose. They were told they were the last line. They were told they would save the nation. What they weren't told was how little time they had. Some never fired a shot. Some surrendered immediately. Some fought because they were too afraid not to, afraid of the enemy ahead and the regime behind them. This was not desperation alone. It was ideology devouring its own future. Because when a state decides children are expendable, the war is already lost, even if the fighting continues. This is the story of the order that sent children to die. By late 1944, Germany was collapsing from every direction. Allied armies pressed in from the west. The Red Army crushed everything in its path from the east. Cities burned. Supply lines snapped. Experienced soldiers were already dead or buried somewhere beneath snow, mud, and rubble. And still, the regime demanded more. What Germany no longer had were men. So it turned to boys. At first, it was framed as a necessity, a temporary measure, a patriotic duty. Schools received notices calling for volunteers. Teachers were instructed to prepare students for national defense. Posters appeared showing smiling youths with rifles slung over their shoulders, standing taller than their years, framed as heirs to a glorious legacy. But the truth moved faster than the propaganda. By the autumn of 1944, the line between education and enlistment vanished entirely. The Hitler Youth, once a pipeline of ideology and obedience, became a reservoir of manpower. Boys as young as 14 were issued uniforms that did not fit, weapons they barely understood, and orders they were never meant to carry. There was no ceremony. One day they were students. Next, they were soldiers. In classrooms across the Reich, lessons stopped mid-sentence. Desks were abandoned. Chalkboards still held unfinished equations. Teachers watched as their students were marched out, not to another lesson, but to the front. Some boys were proud. They had been trained for this moment since childhood. Others were terrified. Many did not yet shave. Some had never fired a rifle. A few still carried letters from home in their pockets, folded and unfolded until the paper softened at the edges. They were told they were the last line. The Volkssturm, Germany's final militia, was born not from strategy but desperation. Elderly men and teenage boys were organized into makeshift units, armed with outdated rifles, single-shot anti-tank weapons, and slogans meant to replace training. Hold the line. Defend your homeland. Victory or annihilation. What those words meant in practice became clear almost immediately. These boys were sent to face seasoned Allied troops supported by tanks, artillery, and air power. They were ordered to defend bridges, crossroads, and ruined city blocks with no hope of reinforcement and no permission to retreat. Failure was not an option, because survival was not considered priority. Behind them stood officers who understood the truth but obeyed anyway. Above them stood leaders who no longer believed the nation deserved to survive if it could not win. And so childhood ended not with a choice, but with a command. The moment came quietly for most. A knock at the door. A name read aloud. A uniform placed in shaking hands. Parents were not asked. Some tried to stop it. Others stood silent, knowing resistance would only make things worse. Mothers watched their sons leave, knowing, without being told, that many would not return. By the time the boys reached the front, the illusion was already gone. They saw bodies before they fired a shot. They heard artillery before they understood fear. They learned quickly that bravery did not stop bullets. Entire units of teenagers were wiped out in hours. Some froze and were shot for cowardice. Others fought with desperate intensity, not out of hatred, but because there was nowhere left to run. The war had reached its most honest phase. No more speeches. No more future promises. Only orders and consequences. Germany had not just mobilized its children. It had sacrificed them. And this was only the beginning. There was no single speech announcing what was about to happen. No dramatic declaration that children would now be sent to die. Instead, it unfolded the way bureaucratic crimes often do. Quietly, incrementally, and wrapped in official language that made catastrophe sound reasonable. On September 25, 1944, Adolf Hitler signed a decree creating the Volkssturm, the People's Storm. On paper, it was described as a last-ditch national defense force. In reality, it was an admission that the German army no longer existed in any functional sense. The decree mobilized all males between the ages of 16 and 60, regardless of training, health, or experience. 16 was not a typo, and in practice, it was often ignored. Local officials, under pressure to meet quotas and prove loyalty, reached lower. 14-year-olds were called up. In some cases, even younger boys were armed and deployed. There were no standardized checks, no meaningful safeguards. The order prioritized numbers over lives. The language of the decree was deliberately vague, but its intent was unmistakable. Germany would fight with whatever bodies remained. Responsibility for implementation was handed to regional Nazi leaders and local commanders, many of whom were civilians with little military experience but absolute ideological loyalty. Training, if it occurred at all, lasted days, sometimes hours. Weapons were distributed haphazardly. Old rifles from World War I, single-use anti-tank launchers that required suicidal proximity to function, ammunition that didn't always match the guns. And still, the orders escalated. In October and November 1944, as Allied forces crossed into German territory, supplementary directives followed. Hitler Youth units were formally integrated into combat roles. Boys previously used for messengers, lookout duty, or air defense were reassigned to frontline resistance. This was not an accident of chaos. It was policy. Internal communications made it clear that retreat was forbidden, regardless of who was holding the position. Bridges were to be defended to the last man. Towns were to be held even when encircled. Withdrawal without permission was treated as treason. For adults, this meant court-martial or execution. For children, it meant death by enemy fire or by their own side. What makes this order particularly chilling is not its brutality, but its calmness. There is no emotional language in the documents, no acknowledgement of age, no discussion of moral cost. The boys are referred to as forces, units, or resources, human beings reduced to inventory. At no point did Hitler or the High Command express concern about the consequences. By this stage of the war, concern for the German population had vanished from decision-making entirely. In private conversations, Hitler made his view explicit. If the German people could not endure the war, then they had proven themselves unworthy of survival. Children were not exempt from this judgment. In fact, they served a purpose beyond the battlefield. Their presence was symbolic. Teenage defenders were meant to shame adults into fighting harder. Their deaths were meant to demonstrate total commitment. The regime believed that if boys were willing to die, no one else had the right to surrender. This logic was not madness. It was ideology taken to its conclusion. The Nazi state had always demanded total loyalty. In its final months, it demanded total sacrifice. And the system enforced compliance ruthlessly. Parents who resisted were threatened. Teachers who hesitated were reported. Officers who questioned the orders were accused of defeatism. Fear ensured participation, even when belief had collapsed. This is where the moral tension begins to harden. Because many of the people executing these orders knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the boys were unprepared. They knew the positions were indefensible. They knew the war was already lost. And yet, the orders were carried out. Not everywhere. Not always. Some commanders quietly reassigned boys to rear duties. Others falsified records. A few openly refused. But enough obeyed. Enough to turn a decree into a graveyard. The crime was not only that children were sent to fight. It was that a system existed where this could happen legally, systematically, and without protest from the top. The order did not scream. It whispered, and the country bled anyway. The order did not march the children to the front by itself. It moved through desks, classrooms, offices, and living rooms, carried forward by ordinary people performing ordinary roles. That is how the machine functioned, not through constant violence, but through routine. The first step was paperwork. Local party officials received lists from Berlin with age brackets and quotas. The instructions were precise enough to demand results, vague enough to deny responsibility. Each district was expected to contribute a certain number of bodies. How those bodies were found was left to the administrators on the ground. School principals were among the first drawn into the process. Attendance records became recruitment tools. Birth dates were checked. Boys were summoned from class and told to report after school with parental consent forms that were barely optional. In some towns, teachers stood at the front of classrooms and read out names, students rising one by one, uncertain whether they would return. Many teachers complied without protest. Some believed the propaganda. Others feared denunciation. A few convinced themselves that service would be brief, symbolic, or safe. Rationalizations varied, but the outcome was the same. Children were handed over. Hitler Youth leaders played a central role. By 1944, the organization had already spent years militarizing adolescents. Drill, discipline, obedience. These were not new ideas of boys being mobilized. What changed was the destination. Training camps became staging areas. Marching songs were replaced by ammunition distribution. Youth leaders were instructed to present the deployment as an honor. Those who hesitated were accused of weakness. Those who resisted were removed. Loyalty was measured not by care for the boys, but by speed of compliance. Parents were the next link in the chain. Some tried to hide their sons. Others forged medical exemptions. A few confronted officials directly, but the system anticipated resistance. Threats were explicit. Families could lose ration cards, housing, or employment. In extreme cases, parents were warned that refusal could be treated as sabotage. Most complied, not because they believed, but because the cost of refusal felt unbearable. This is where complicity becomes most uncomfortable. The majority of people involved were not fanatics. They were exhausted civilians navigating a collapsing state. They did not create the policy, but they enabled it, step by step, until refusal seemed impossible. The final gatekeepers were the officers. Many were reservist civil servants or aging veterans pulled back into service. They received boys who could barely shoulder their weapons. They saw shaking hands, oversized uniforms, and fear barely masked by bravado. And still, many assigned them to combat positions. Some officers justified it as a necessity, others as obedience. A few admitted later that they believed the boys might survive if they held long enough for reinforcements that never came. Others knew better. They knew the lines would collapse. They knew the enemy tanks would not stop. They knew the boys would die. Yet orders were orders. This is how the machine sustained itself. Not through a single villain, but through a distributed system of responsibility where everyone controlled a small piece and no one claimed ownership of the outcome. No single act felt decisive. No single person felt fully guilty. But together, they produced a result that no one could deny. Children stood in trenches facing trained soldiers. They guarded bridges under artillery fire. They were told to hold towns that had already been abandoned by regular units. When they broke, and many did, the system responded with punishment. Desertion laws applied equally. Military police arrested the boys trying to flee. Some were beaten. Some were executed as examples. Their age offered no protection. The machine did not adjust. It did not pause. It processed lives until there were none left to process. And after the war, when survivors tried to understand how this could have happened, the answers were disturbingly simple. Because everyone did their job. Because no one wanted to be the first to say no. Because fear flowed downward as efficiently as orders flowed outward. The machine did not require belief. It required participation. And that is what makes it dangerous. The places where these children died were not legendary battlefields. They were villages without names that anyone remembers. Road junctions, collapsed bridges, railway embankments, half-built trenches scraped into frozen ground. There were no grand offensives here. No cinematic charges. No turning points marked on maps. Just Boys told to hold positions that no longer mattered. In the final months of the war, Germany's front lines were porous and unstable. Units dissolved, reformed, vanished. Communication broke down. Orders arrived late, or not at all. Into this chaos, children were inserted as if they were interchangeable parts. They were often deployed as last resort stopgaps. A platoon destroyed overnight would be replaced not with trained infantry, but with teenagers carrying single rifles between two of them. Some were assigned anti-tank weapons that they could barely lift. Others were told to dig in and wait for armor they had never seen before, except in propaganda posters. When the enemy arrived, the reality was immediate and overwhelming. Artillery did not pause because the defenders were young. Machine guns did not hesitate. Tanks did not slow down. Witnesses later described seeing boys frozen in place, unable to move, staring at the ground that erupted around them. Some dropped their weapons and ran. Some fired blindly. Some stood until they were buried where they had been told to stand. Entire units vanished in hours. In some sectors, the casualties were so complete that no official reports were ever filed. No one survived long enough to document what happened. The records end with deployment orders. What followed exists only in fragments, shell craters, mass graves, and memories no one was eager to preserve. Civilians found the bodies later. Farmers returned to their fields after the fighting stopped. Women searching for missing relatives. Old men pulling apart collapsed sheds. They found uniforms too large, boots stuffed with paper, identification tags with birth years that made no sense. Children. Some were still clutching weapons. Others had no ammunition left. Many had no visible wounds at all, killed by blast pressure, exposure, or shock. These were not soldiers who had chosen war. They had been placed inside it. Medical care was almost non-existent. Field hospitals prioritized experienced units. Boys who were wounded and survived long enough to be evacuated were often left untreated for days. Infections spread. Amputations were common. Pain relief was scarce. Some begged to be sent home. Most were told there was no home left to send them to. The horror did not end when the shooting stopped. Survivors carried injuries that followed them for life. Missing limbs, damaged lungs, shattered hearing. Others carried something less visible. The memory of being abandoned by a system that had promised them honor and delivered them to slaughter. What makes this horror distinct is not just the age of the victims. It is the absence of necessity. These deployments did not alter the outcome of the war. They did not stop the advance. They did not buy meaningful time. In many cases, the enemy forces they faced bypassed the positions entirely after destroying them. The children died, holding ground that no one intended to defend. This is where grief turns to quiet rage. Not because war is cruel, that is understood, but because this cruelty was deliberate, avoidable, and concealed behind language like duty and sacrifice. There were no victory parades for these units. No medals waiting at the end. No acknowledgement in official histories. Their deaths were not framed as a tragedy. They were treated as expenditure. And long after the battlefield fell silent, the question remained unspoken, unanswered. What kind of system looks at a child and decides they are an acceptable delay? When the war ended, the world moved forward with remarkable speed. Borders were redrawn. Governments collapsed or rebranded themselves. Trials were held. New enemies were identified. New futures were promised. History, it seemed, had no patience for what did not fit neatly into victory or defeat. The children who had been sent to die did not fit. There were no mass funerals for them. No national days of mourning. No speeches acknowledging that the final months of the war had been fought, in part, by those who should never have been there at all. Instead, there was silence. Official records were vague. Casualty lists grouped them under generic categories: youth auxiliaries, emergency formations, last reserves. Ages were omitted. Context was erased. What remained was clean, administrative, and intentionally incomplete. Families searching for answers encountered walls. Some were told their sons had died in action, as if that phrase carried explanation. Others were informed that records had been lost during the chaos of retreat. Many received nothing at all, no confirmation, no remains, no place to grieve. Mothers waited for years. In villages and cities across the defeated nation, bedrooms were left untouched. School books remained on desks. Winter coats hung unused. The war had taken fathers, brothers, neighbors, but the loss of children carried a different weight, one that did not align with the language of honor or sacrifice. And the state had no words for it. In the immediate post-war years, survival came first. People were hungry, homeless, displaced. Questioning how the war had been fought was seen as dangerous, even indecent. To ask why children had been sent to front was to risk accusations of disloyalty, or worse, of undermining collective suffering. So the questions went unasked. When new governments took power, they shaped memory carefully. Narratives were built around resilience, victimhood, or heroic resistance, depending on what served legitimacy best. The uncomfortable truth that children had been knowingly sacrificed did not serve any of these stories. It implied responsibility, and responsibility required accountability. Instead, blame was diffused into abstraction. The chaos of the final months, the desperation of total war, the breakdown of command. These phrases softened reality. They suggested inevitability rather than decision. The individuals who signed the orders rarely spoke of them again. Some returned to civilian life. Others retained influence. Few faced consequences. The machinery that had enabled the deployments dissolved quietly, leaving no clear target for outrage. As years passed, memory thinned. Survivors aged. Witnesses died. Stories that were not written down became rumors. Then whispers. Then nothing at all. In textbooks, the war ended cleanly, with surrender, liberation, and reconstruction. The final, chaotic bloodletting faded into footnotes. Those who had been children were now ghosts. Occasionally, fragments surfaced. A diary found in an attic. A letter was discovered behind a wall. A photograph showing a unit that was all too young. These moments pierced the silence briefly, then disappeared again, dismissed as anomalies, exceptions, tragedies without context. But they were not exceptions. They were the result of a system that had already decided life was expendable, so long as it delayed defeat. The bitterness comes not only from what happened, but from how thoroughly it was buried. To forget is not neutral. It is a choice. And in choosing silence, history denied these children even the dignity of being remembered for what they were, victims of an order that valued time over humanity. The war took their lives. The aftermath took their story. And for decades, that absence shaped how the past was understood, not as it was, but as it was allowed to be remembered. When the last witnesses are gone, history faces a choice. It can become a record of events, clean, distant, contained, or it can remain a warning, alive with meaning, demanding to be questioned. The story of the order that sent children to die exists at that crossroads. Because what happened was not an accident. It was not chaos alone. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision made under pressure, justified by fear, and executed by a system that believed survival excused everything. That is what makes it dangerous. The order did not require hatred. It did not require cruelty in the ordinary sense. It required compliance. It relied on the willingness of ordinary people to accept that something unthinkable had become necessary. Teachers handed over students. Officials stamped documents. Officers gave commands they did not want to question. Each action was small. Each was defensible on its own. Together, they created a path that led children from classrooms to graves. This is how such crimes endure, not through monsters, but through normalization. History often asks us to identify villains, names, faces, ideologies. But the deeper lesson here is more unsettling. Systems do not need evil to function. They need obedience, urgency, and silence. And those conditions are not rare. Every era faces moments of fear. Moments when leaders claim there is no time for debate. When emergency measures are framed as temporary. When human cost is reduced to numbers. Because numbers feel manageable. In those moments, the line between protection and sacrifice becomes dangerously thin. The order that sent children to die crossed that line and never looked back. What followed was not immediate collapse. There was no uprising, no mass refusal. Life continued. The machinery kept turning. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling part, because it worked, not in moral terms, not in human terms, but in the narrow logic of delay, control, and appearances. It achieved its aim. The system survived a little longer. The front held. Time was bought. And once something works, it becomes precedent. That is how extraordinary measures become ordinary ones. How the unthinkable becomes merely difficult. How, one day, someone can look at a child and see not a life, but a resource. The children themselves had no such abstractions. They did not die for ideology. They did not die for strategy. They died confused, afraid, and far from home, trying to understand why the world had suddenly decided they were expendable. History owes them more than silence. It owes honesty, not to assign guilt across generations, but to recognize patterns before they repeat. To understand that fear, once legitimized, rarely stays contained. It moves outward from the battlefield into institutions, into law, into daily life. The question that remains is not confined to the past. It is not about one country, one war, or one order. It is this: when survival is used to justify everything, who decides what and who is expendable? And when that decision is made again, as it always is, will it be recognized for what it is? Or will it arrive, once more, wrapped in necessity, signed quietly, and carried out by people who tell themselves they had no choice? That is the inheritance of this story. Not outrage, not condemnation, but vigilance. Because history does not repeat itself the same way. It waits for the moment when fear feels reasonable again, and asks whether anyone remembers what it cost last time.